In the soulful world of music, James Horner was one of the most talented composers, known for producing music for some of the iconic movies like Titanic and Avatar. From humble beginnings, he rose to become one of the most influential film composers of his generation. However, just as his melodies reached millions of people around the globe, something unexpected happened. Join us as we explore the life of James Horner, a musical genius whose final moments still remain hauntingly unforgettable. James Roy Horner was born in Los Angeles, California on August 14, 1953, to a renowned film set designer Harry Horner and Joan Frankel. Due to the growing uproar in Czechia in 1935, Harry made the life-changing decision to relocate to the U.S. Upon arriving, he made a name for himself as a set designer and even won a Grammy for his work. As a boy, little James learned to play piano and even violin thanks to his parents. Not many know this, but James had a deep passion for adventure, particularly for flying. He often used to look up at the sky and dream about flying his own plane one day, not knowing that someday this dream would come true. James spent most of his teenage years in Los Angeles and later went to London in order to study at Royal College of Music. Under the guidance of Giorgio Ligeti, a well-known composer of the time, James began refining his musical talent. There he realized that he wanted to pursue a path as a classical composer. However, deep down he knew that if he wanted to make big in music, he needed to be in the United States. So James moved back to California and joined UCLA and also got his doctorate in music degree. After this, James completely turned his focus on producing music for movies. Although he started small with some low-budget movies, it further opened the door for big opportunities. One of his life-changing moments came in 1982 when he was asked to compose the score for Star Trek II. Funny thing was, director Nicholas Meyer jokingly admitted in his interview that the studio was initially thinking of hiring Jerry Goldsmith for this job. However, they didn't have the budget to afford him. In fact, according to Nicholas, it was a gamble that really paid off. And when Meyer returned for Star Trek IV, he couldn't afford Horner either. Throughout the 1980s, James worked with many blockbuster movies, including Alien, for which he earned his first Oscar nomination. In the 90s era, James shifted to his style and leaned more towards emotional tunes. With some iconic movies like Braveheart, Apollo 13, and A Beautiful Mind, he started making waves in the world of music. James' second life-changing moment came in 1997 when he worked for the blockbuster movie Titanic. In fact, he was able to sell over 27 million copies of his soundtrack and even won 2 Academy Awards. The iconic song, My Heart Will Go On, even won 3 Grammys and 2 Golden Globes. In 2007, director James Cameron brought him back for Avatar, which would become one of the most successful movies of his career. However, it was no easy task. In fact, James spent almost 2 years on the project and did not work on any other project during this time. He even later said that it was the hardest job of his career. In 2010, James Horner got his third life-changing chance to compose music for a short film called Horseman Cometh. And it was there he met Ed Shipley, a veteran stunt pilot. Eddie took him up into the clouds, showing him what it feels like moving with the wind. And that changed everything. Up in the clouds dancing in a plane, James felt something he couldn't quite put into words. However, he did put it into his music. For once in his entire career, James got a chance to put what he experienced into the music. Without any directors telling him what to do, he recorded with his usual orchestra members, and he created something he would describe as a ballet tune, where 3 planes dance on the stage known as Sky. That moment made him realize that one day, he wanted to be the one in that cockpit, pulling those same maneuvers. Over the next few years, he learned how to fly the plane, got his license, and established himself as an experienced pilot. In fact, he collected quite the collection of the plane during this time span. He would spend hours flying his newly bought single-engine S312 Tucano. And sometimes just for the thrill, he'd pull a few stunts, dipping and climbing through the air like a man chasing the horizon. Little did he know, this love for thrill would one day be the reason for the tragedy. On June 22, 2015, in the early morning, James Horner arrived at the Camarillo airport and fueled his personal aircraft, being ready for yet another solo flight. The weather conditions were normal and visibility was perfect. By that time, James wasn't new to flying. In fact, he had over 800 hours of flight experience, which one could say is equivalent to some of the skilled pilots. His small aircraft lifted from a runway and headed north towards the rugged terrains of Los Padres National Forest. During this entire time, James was in constant contact with the Southern California Air Traffic Control Center. At around 8:30 a.m., he radioed the message to the controller that he would be performing acrobatic maneuvers between 2,000 and 10,000 feet above sea level. However, the controller responded with a warning that if he dipped below 7,000 feet, he'd most probably lose a radio signal because of the rough mountain terrain. On top of that, flying at such low altitude has its own set of dangers. James acknowledged the warning and decided to perform stunts within a safe range. At around 9:21 a.m., the controller radioed James to let him know about another aircraft, which was just 4 miles away from him and flying slightly above him. James answered after a few minutes that he'd be looking out for it and turned his plane slightly to the east. Roughly a minute later, the controller gave him the update that the other aircraft is getting closer, but since he moved to the east, he should be in the safe distance. At about 9:28 a.m., James radioed the message that he was going to perform one last maneuver, where he'd do a rapid descent and a sharp climb back to 9,000 feet. And after this, he was planning to head back to the airport. The control center approved it and started waiting for a further confirmation from James that he made it through. However, no response came from his side. And on top of that, his plane had completely disappeared from the radar. The silence began to grow heavier, and although it couldn't get any more bad, a commercial aircraft flying over the forest spotted an unusual fire at the riverbank and reported it to the control tower. They contacted the local authorities, and when they arrived at the scene, it didn't take long to confirm the worst. The aircraft wreckage belonged to James Horner. The plane had broken apart on impact, and the fire had already damaged over 2 acres of land nearby. An investigation followed quickly, and FAA radar data shed some light on the tragedy. At that time, James flew so close to the mountaintops that he was just 100 feet above the ridgelines. In fact, for the last 6 minutes of flight, he stayed around 1,600 feet above ground, which one could say was pretty risky. A sheriff deputy living a few miles away from the crash site said that he saw the plane flying over his head. It was flying normal according to him. However, the aircraft did feel a little closer than usual. When investigators looked through the wreckage, they didn't find any trouble with the engine or any kind of failure in the airplane. It was more like the aircraft was in perfect condition before the takeoff. Also, they found that the aircraft impacted the ground at a 45-degree angle, which is more like nosedive. James, on the other hand, got ejected during the accident when the safety mechanism kicked in. During that time, his body completely got damaged and he lost his life on impact. Authorities chose not to perform an autopsy because of the condition his body was in. However, they did run the toxicology tests, and the results told a completely different story. There were small traces of alcohol, though it could be because of the natural changes in the body after death. What was more shocking was the traces of butalbital and codeine, which according to them are usually found in headache medicines. The problem is that both can slow down the reaction speed of the body. The NTSB was quite sure that those chemicals might have played a big role in the crash. And in the highest stress moments of that flight, James might not have been thinking clearly. It might have been a classic case of spatial disorientation, according to them, where one moment you feel you are flying straight, but in fact you are descending at the rapid speed. James was 61 when the news broke out to the world. Soon all the news channels got flooded with James Horner, untimely death. The entire film world felt the tremors when his assistant, Sylvia, confirmed the news with an official Facebook post explaining the details. He died while doing what he loved, she further said in her post. Many celebrities who had worked with James before came forward telling about the man behind the music. However, something unexpected happened because of this tragedy. Many online communities around the world started talking about the pressure faced by artists. This became a topic of interest, and many people started appreciating the people who are behind the scenes of their favorite movies. James once said that music is a soundtrack of our lives, and it captures what words cannot say. One could say that, throughout his life, he lived by these lines. He didn't just create music. He told a story through his melodies. He poured his soul into every note, and in doing so, gave us soundtracks we'll never forget. His story may have ended suddenly, but his music lives on in theaters and memories and every heart that's ever been moved by his melodies. If you found this story moving, be sure to check out our other videos for more tragic stories. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload.